Free the land. Today is Khallid Day. It's a day that we venerate one known as Khalid Abdul Muhammad, not in the way of a personality cult, but through personality we understand some principles. When we look at the man that we become to know as Khalid Abdul Muhammad, a name that he got while in the Nation of Islam, many of his highlights is attributed to his Million Youth March, battling out with Rudy Giuliani. Some may even think of his time in the nation, whether it being ousted, being on the rostrum, being on TV shows like Phil Donahue and Like It Is with Gil Noble. He would later be in issues with people like Irv Rubin of the Jewish Defense Organization. Further, he would be censored by the House of Representatives, labeled a bigot, and leader of a Panther faction, the New Black Panther Party. Going to his upbringing, born Harold Moore Jr., he was born in Houston in the 5th Ward, graduating from the Phyllis Wheatley High School, of course during the time of segregation. Texas, a place of extreme racism, home of Juneteenth celebrations. Church, Bible Belt. He would be on debate teams. He'd be quarterback of the football team. He was known to be one who could swim. In a documentary, it said that he saved one of his childhood friends from drowning. He would participate in ministry as a youth minister. Later on, going to a school in New Orleans, being an avid reader of Black history. Revolutionary Black Nationalism by Malcolm X. It's even said that he had a Malcolm X chain on, a medallion, while hosting Louis Farrakhan at his college in New Orleans, where he would soon be recruited, going to processing, join the Nation of Islam in the 70s. Through this background, we see one of studious, graduating at the top of his class. His time in the Nation of Islam, he was one that was disciplined, nonsense, clear cut. He was a trainer of the FOI, Fruit of Islam, the military training of men. And going to the top of even being the spokesperson of the nation, national assistant. Later on ousted for his remarks during a time where the nation was getting into it with the Jewish Defense League and the Anti-Defamation League. His historic King College, where he used phrases and speeches from his famed tape that he gave in Africa under the name of Malik Rashidin. was talking about apartheid. He was talking about the Zionist hands and the theft of the resources of Africa, and tied that back into white supremacy and Zionism attacking the community of New Africans in the hills of America. Although his name is known amongst hardcore fanatics of Black nationalism and just being pro-Black, as his voice and influence touched that of the entertainers, Scarface, Ice Cube, Public Enemy, his voice being laced over all of these intros and tracks. He filled the void that we've seen in time. This void would go to how in the 90s there was a new brand of nationalism that dwelled in capitalism, conservatism, but still it did not go to the root of the situation, and that was white supremacy and menticide. With Khallid, him coming into the new Black Panther Party, but also even in the Nation of Islam, he mainlined Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and Black liberation theology. This could be seen in many of his speeches throughout his time as a Black activist. He identified himself with the struggles of African people worldwide. He would mention the names of people like Amilcar Cabral. He would mention SNCC. He would mention Kwame Ture. He would talk about new African freedom fighters of the 60s and 70s. He would speak about the corruption inside of politics and how, as the time of the ballot of the bullet transitioned, some of the things that Malcolm had called for now have been blocked. And it shows that Black nationalism must also take the separatist approach and the Afro-centered thought. Although he himself going to white schools, he himself being a part of different trips around the world for anthropology, he used his high accreditation. He used these as tools to prove why Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, Black liberation theology, all were needed to be mainlined in the 90s. Some would label him a prophet. There would even be some who would try to talk like him, who would try to preach like him. It would even be some, and many, claiming to uphold his legacy. But let's question what makes a legacy. What's left? Is it just the person and their charisma? Or is it their actions? And if it's the actions, what were those actions? Often, many times you would hear Khallid saying that when it comes to Black, that it is our culture. It is a constant connection with the cosmos. He would talk about how we must call for an African united front, a Black united front. He would use them interchangeably. He would refer to our people as Africans. Yet he would be able to talk to Hebrew Israelites. He would be able to talk to Crips and Bloods. He would be able to, doing that while in the nation, talking about God and the many different names of African traditional religions. While in the nation, he would talk about the need of separation, that we must unify, we must organize, and then we must separate from white supremacy. He talked about the new man and the new woman and ways of expressing it of have you been baptized? And Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, Black liberation theology. Have you destroyed the white mind inside of you? As often as many times we use his quotes to talk about white society and the evils of white supremacy, some of his most critically acclaimed quotes have been forgotten, as you hear it on the Night of the Living Baseheads. Him greatly galvanizing the people to the point where now you have artists exemplifying a conscious renaissance, a change of thought. You seen one rapper go from niggas with attitude then becoming America's most wanted. But when we talk about principle and what he upheld, we see that this man had a crazy amount of transfer culture upon the organizations he was in. It's written in the book that whenever he organized in a group, those that he couldn't organize, he had some form of fashion to getting them to some form of goal, and then getting them to, as he would say, be an agent of change wherever they are. He told people not to leave the church, not to leave their Bible studies, not to leave their churches, not to leave their masjids, but wherever they at, be a revolutionary. This open door policy at this time seemed like the greatest advance of attention by those that formed this organization. As this organization came about through the likes of Panther influenced men, some of them believing and calling themselves New African, the organization that aided the new Black Panther Party in its early days was a group of men referring to themselves as a New African Revolutionist movement in Texas. They believe that this new Black Panther Party must consist of the ideologies of Afro-centered thought, revolutionary Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and Black liberation theology. As we see the Panther groups and we see many other organizations through the 60s and 70s go underground as they were spied on and attacked by the intelligence community of the state. Again, the Nation of Islam was one that was still filling the void, and later on, as it changed its orientation, there began to be clashes in where our community was going. This 90 period was at the height of Black figures being in government seats, being on TV, being entertainers. The likes of Khallid would forever remind us to keep Black separatism as our agenda, understanding that we must control our own, we must build our own, we must think for ourselves, and the plans that we use must be of our own. He said that anything that we do, if we cannot see our people in it, if it cannot aid us, then throw it away. He even said that you must throw it in the trash can if you cannot use your religion to aid you, if you cannot use your culture or anything to aid you for our Black people. You throw that in the trash can, and he said use that trash can to attack white supremacy. One of the most things that also must be highlighted about Khalid Abdul Muhammad is that everything that he was doing was not of a new ideology. Some of these things were echoed thoughts from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. As his idea of black separatism comes directly from the Nation of Islam, one of the main things he would state was, whenever going into our story as a people and looking for answers, he talked about Sankofa. And he would line this up with one of the most famous Elijah Muhammad speeches. And that would be, out of all of our studies, history is most qualified and to reward our research. Because if we know what's happening yesterday, then we can intelligently figure out why what's happening today. And if we know what's today, then we will know tomorrow, because today is based on yesterday, just as tomorrow is built on today. What he allowed was to go back through the chapters of our history throughout that golden era in the 60s and highlight whether it be an error, highlight where it be a success, and tell us to study. Again, this is one who was at the top of his class in all of his studies, both in white society, but most importantly in black activism. A man that really was telling us about the new African independence movement, one that was calling all organizations to come together. He would say, die as a tribe and be born a nation. So even as now, as we see tribalism, we see infighting, we must look at these as that same mental side that Khalid Abdul Muhammad spoke about, these four devils. You know, when you see lust, envy, hate, and jealousy, we see infighting. We see people get hurt, people shot. We see factionalism. This principle must be highlighted that he talked about, because this very same four devils is what got him shot up in Riverside in the 90s after being ousted from the Nation of Islam. It is said that Khalid's time, if you read Brother Vibrant White's book on the Nation of Islam, it was said that during this time that there was a lot of infighting with Khalid Muhammad due to his hard line interpretations of the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He speaks that the Nation of Islam at one point is going in the direction as they were uniting with other groups, and that Khalid's highly use of the book Secret Relations Between Blacks and Jews was hurting the relationship between the Nation of Islam and other mainstream bourgeoisie groups that were more close to the government than the people. We would see Khalid Muhammad barred from speaking at the Million Man March. We would later even see infighting amongst the organization that he came from. We don't blame organizations, as Kwame Ture always says, when something goes wrong, but we blame the people for not upholding the ideology of those organizations. This assessment must be used, this approach must be used for our assessment of the current day. As we see year after year in the highlights of our time, everything that stops our forward progression, while the heightening of white supremacy happens, it always comes from an infight. We already know that we are prisoners of a war that some of us do not even know is happening until the rebirth of your mind, until you get conscious of that fact. So when we look at the four devils, we look at this mental side that Bobby E. Wright talks about. We understand that there must be a rebuilding of the mind. This comes back to the new man, new woman. And no holds, no barred, Khallid would talk about some of his mistakes. He would talk about certain conflicts with members and conflicts with personalities and headlines in the public of his life. But he would speak about that he was a new Khallid and that he has a new mind. He spoke about him going more into the Afro-centered thought and teachings, more going inside of the history of Africa, more going inside of the fight of the new Africans in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. As this is just used as talking points amongst those who shout its name but have no love for their brothers or sisters, one thing that Khallid always talked about was the event junkie. He talked about those who know every quote but don't live it or put it to use. He talked about those who try to act so secretive upon reproach, but yet you can catch them anytime acting as though they're aiding in some form of faction to any form of organizing. The more that he talked about this Black United Front, and we go into the basic tenets and see what this is, we ask ourselves, how can this be realized today? We furthermore ask, why is this not more realized today? Why is it that a man's speeches from 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and etc. seem so relevant? And why does it seem like the problems of the past still happen today? One of the things that happened during Khalid's life shows us the principle of reconciliation. If it's not being upheld, nobody wins during this time. He said that he was going through an examination period and that the 90s is just a 6 upside down. Khallid himself being one who was big inside of the Supreme Wisdom lessons, teaching, and as well as the 120. That being the same, but if you look in your Supreme mathematics, 6 is equality, 9 is born. So everything that we see in the 60s, as we see that manifest in the 90s, it brought back a resurgence of the movement. This movement we're talking about is the Black Liberation Movement. This movement we're talking about is the Black Power Movement. This movement we're talking about is the New African Independence Movement. As we see in the last speech, where it was said that revolution is the only solution. We've seen Baba Herman Ferguson right there in the crowd.
Baba Herman Ferguson was a member of RAM. He would never a member of the American Met Society. The American Met Society was an organization founded by notable the Henry brothers, where people know about Guy Aberdeen, Amari Aberdeen, and also Lawrence Henry, which were their older brother. It was founded in 1967, whereas in Detroit, Michigan, where the American Met Society consists of various members who were from RAM, who were from the Black Shrine of Madonna, who were from the Freedom Now Party, from the Gold Organization, all organizations that was existing in Detroit at that time. Whereas when Malcolm X's assassination in 1965, people like Amari Mugaidi Aberdeen, who was a part of his various organizations with Malcolm X, such as RAM or other organizations, they were actually students of Malcolm X, also worked with research, worked with publications, so forth and so on, right, with Malcolm X, right? So upon the assassination in 1966, Amari Aberdeen wrote a document called The War in America, it became known as the Malcolm X Doctrine. And the Malcolm X Doctrine, The War in America, became the foundational document of the Malcolm X Society in 1967, where the Malcolm X Society put out a letter dated March the 15th, 1968, the letter was put out to the very organization, very individuals that were interested in establishing a black government, a black nation, right? It later became known as Republic of Africa, on March 31st, 1960, in Detroit, Michigan, right? And the Malcolm X doctrine became a standpoint in what you term a New African Creed. But it's, I believe, the Malcolm X doctrine. And also, the original New African Creed said, it said, by the grace of our ancestors and the grace of Malcolm X, I am a New African. And Malcolm X is considered to be the ideological father of the Republic of New Africa. You know, he's the ideological father himself. You know, and in the midst of that, we have an understanding in regards to Malcolm X talking about internationalism, nationhood, self-defense, things of that nature, what became a fabric of the New African independent movement in general. When a person say he's or she is a New African, they're actually saying that they are Pan-African in a sense because they identify with the African struggle worldwide. Instead of African struggle worldwide, you have political science, but they also understand that the Africa that they talking about right now currently is the African America, which is the Republic of Africa. But they also know that they might have international support for the African countries around the world. You know, and that basically what the New African is, especially in the sense of Malcolm X, right? And his affiliation and association with those particular organizations and those individuals, right? Whereas Khalid Muhammad himself, being a student of Malcolm X, being a student of Elijah Muhammad, being a student of other individuals, right? For example, when Khalid Muhammad took over leadership in the New Black Panther Party, they had various uniforms, right? That they wore. They might have a suit that they wear. They might have a Panther uniform they wear. They might also have an African attire. You know, and those are symbolic of different types of lifestyles. Especially considering that Khalid Muhammad had a relationship with the New African Independent Movement, had a relationship with the RBG movement, relationship, with the global movement, Pan-African nationalism. He's a New African citizen. He had a relationship with the New African Security Forces. He had a relationship with the New African Scouts, New African Panthers. At the time when Tupac was the chairman of the New African Panthers, which is a higher echelon of the New African Scout, which is also a degree New African Scout. He started at 13, currently now all with 17. Tupac was 17 when he came into the situation, the chairperson at that time. All these things relate to a global and international struggle for African people worldwide. And I yield. Free the land.